At sunrise, the Colosseum stirred awake. The air smelled of iron, sweat, and something darker. Beneath its arches, half-starved beasts clawed at their cages, and trembling prisoners waited for a death they couldn't escape. Above them, 50,000 voices rose, eager not for justice or truth, but for blood. This was Rome at its most powerful, and its most cruel. A civilization that conquered half the world, yet built its glory on suffering. Here, death wasn't punishment. It was performance. Every scream, every strike of the sword, every collapsing body was applause for an empire that made cruelty a ritual. But how did a society that gave us philosophy, law, and architecture also turn pain into pleasure? What kind of world cheered while people burned, drowned, or were torn apart just to keep crowds entertained? Today, we're stepping into the sand, into the shadow of an empire that blurred the line between spectacle and savagery. If you love exploring the dark corners of ancient history, hit like and subscribe. It helps us keep uncovering stories that reveal what humanity is truly capable of, at its best and its worst. Share this video with someone who thinks they know Rome. They might see it differently after this. At first, there were no roaring crowds, no marble seats, no golden gates, just a stench of smoke, sweat, and fear. In 264 BC, Rome's first gladiator fight took place not in an arena, but in a cattle market. The sons of Decimus Junius Brutus, Scaeva, wanted to honor their dead father. But instead of prayers or songs, they chose blood. 3 pairs of slaves were armed and ordered to fight to the death. The crowd didn't cheer. They watched in silence, believing every strike carried meaning, that each drop of blood helped guide the dead man's soul toward peace. This was called munus, a duty owed to the deceased. In those early days, death was sacred. It wasn't about pleasure or sport. It was about power, the power to sacrifice another life in honor of your own name. But power is addictive, and Rome would soon learn to crave it. The idea spread quickly. Among Rome's neighbors, warriors were often killed at graves to appease spirits. But the Romans made it a spectacle. They realized watching men fight was more thrilling than ritual slaughter. The victims became performers, the mourners became spectators, and a new form of entertainment was born. Over time, these funerary duels grew grander. The sons of nobles competed to host the most magnificent games, not to honor their dead, but to show off wealth and influence. What began as grief turned into bragging rights. By the 3rd century BC, blood had become a political tool. The Senate and ambitious leaders saw how the sight of death could unite the restless masses. Instead of mourning one man, the people now gathered to celebrate Rome itself. Every fight reminded them who ruled, the men who controlled life and death. Even the armor told a story. Early gladiators were dressed as Rome's conquered enemies. There was the Samnite with a heavy shield, the Thracian with a curved blade, and the Gaul with a broadsword. Watching them die wasn't random. It was symbolic. Every drop of blood was a reminder that Rome crushed its foes. The arena became a living history book, written in screams and steel. Soon, the games no longer needed funerals to exist. They became events of their own, hosted in marketplaces, temples, and public squares. The crowd learned to cheer. The fighters learned to kill. And Rome learned that violence could hold an empire together. What began as a duty to the dead became an addiction of the living. Each contest was louder, bloodier, more elaborate. The Romans called it spectacula, spectacles. But for those in the sand, there was no spectacle, only survival. And as the cheers grew louder, something inside Rome began to shift. The line between ritual and cruelty blurred, and the people who once watched to honor the dead began to crave death itself. By the time the Republic stretched across Italy, gladiator games were no longer sacred rituals. They were strategy. Rome's leaders saw what the crowd wanted: blood, spectacle, and the feeling of power without risk. So they gave it to them. What began as private mourning became public manipulation. Festivals once meant to honor gods slowly turned into stages for control. At first, they were small, wooden stands built for a few hundred. But as the cheers grew, so did the ambition. Stone replaced timber. Seats rose in tiers. The games were no longer personal. They were political. Every drop of blood spilled in the arena reminded citizens who ruled the empire. Watching slaves and captives fight wasn't just entertainment. It was a lesson. It said, "This is Rome. This is what happens to those who defy it." The Senate framed the spectacles as piety, calling them offerings to Jupiter or Mars. But the crowd understood. It wasn't faith. It was fear wrapped in ceremony. Leaders like Julius Caesar realized a well-timed festival could calm the restless, distract the poor, and glorify power. When laws failed, the game succeeded. Gladiator schools multiplied across the city. In cramped cells, men trained under brutal discipline. Most were slaves, war captives, or criminals. A few joined willingly, chasing fame or debt relief. But once inside, there was no freedom, only the chance to die well. Trainers shaped them into living symbols of Rome's might. Each fighter's gear represented a conquered people. When the Thracian fell, the crowd remembered the wars in the east. When the Gaul bled out, they recalled victories in the north. Every wound retold conquest. Every corpse was propaganda. And Rome made sure no one forgot. Senators competed to host grander games, each seeking applause that could translate into votes. The richer the bloodshed, the higher the prestige. Generosity wasn't measured in gold anymore, but in bodies. By the late Republic, the arena was inseparable from politics. Before elections, candidates staged massive spectacles, promising bread and violence. Voters didn't demand policy, they demanded excitement. Control of the crowd became control of the city. Even religion bent under this new order. What once sanctified death now glorified it. Priests blessed weapons. Processions carried images of gods alongside the condemned. Piety became performance. But something deeper stirred beneath the cheers. The more Rome celebrated killing, the more it needed it. The games no longer just reflected Rome's power, they fed it. Without constant spectacle, the empire risked silence, and silence was dangerous. So the cycle continued. More games, more deaths, more distraction. And as the crowd screamed approval, Rome's rulers smiled, knowing loyalty could be bought with blood. The arena was no longer just a stage. It was policy. The roar of the crowd was one thing. The roar that answered from the cages below was another. Rome's appetite for spectacle soon turned to the wild. Gladiators were not enough. The people demanded new terrors, creatures so strange and deadly they seemed born from nightmares. They called these events Venationes, hunts. But this wasn't hunting. It was extermination dressed as theater. From every corner of the empire, caravans carried the doomed. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes, creatures Rome had no name for. The journey was cruel. Many died before reaching the city. Those that survived were starved, beaten, and chained until the day their cages opened. In 46 BC, Julius Caesar shocked the people by parading a giraffe through the streets, calling it a wonder of the earth. But wonder soon turned to blood. The beast was thrown into the sand and torn apart before a cheering crowd. It was a message. If Rome could capture such a creature, nothing was beyond its grasp. When the Colosseum opened under Emperor Titus in AD 80, the hunts reached monstrous scale. For 100 days, animals poured into the arena. 9,000 died. Lions, tigers, bears, bulls, ostriches, elephants, all slaughtered to amuse the mob. Archaeologists have found bones with deep knife marks, evidence of starvation before release. The beasts were weakened, made easier prey for the hunters who stood waiting with spears and nets. Some were trained killers. Others were condemned men given a final task, fight and die. Behind the spectacle lay a network of suffering. Hunters risked their lives trapping these animals. Ships carried cages across the sea. Merchants profited from the trade in death. The empire turned nature itself into a commodity. Even emperors joined the act. Commodus, hungry for adoration, entered the arena dressed as Hercules. He slaughtered hundreds of animals himself, lions chained to posts, elephants already wounded, ostriches fleeing nowhere. The people clapped, not out of awe, but fear. Silence was dangerous. Writers of the time noticed what few dared to say. Pliny the Elder warned that some species were vanishing. The wilds were emptying. But Rome didn't care. Extinction was invisible compared to applause. These shows were not just cruelty. They were conquest made visible. Every lion's death symbolized Africa subdued. Every elephant's fall echoed victory over Carthage. The empire proved not only that it could kill men, but that it could cage the wild itself. For the Romans, this was power at its purest, command over nature, over life, over creation. But as the sand turned red, the question lingered. How long can a civilization cheer for death before it forgets what life is worth? To the roaring crowd, the gladiator looked like a hero. Bronze gleamed under the sun. Muscles rippled with every move. He stood tall, fearless, ready. But behind the armor, he was a man owned by someone else. Most gladiators never chose the arena. They were prisoners of war, slaves, or condemned criminals. Some sold themselves into service for money or fame. But once they entered the ludus, the training school, they ceased to belong to themselves. Every breath, every bruise, every scar became property of the empire. Training was brutal. Days began before dawn with drills in heat and dust. Wooden swords toughened the arms. Punishments broke defiance. Discipline ruled everything. Even laughter could cost a meal. Those who survived learned more than combat. They learned to die well. Because in Rome, a good death could be worth more than a good life. Fighters were branded, fed on barley to bulk up, and paired against carefully chosen opponents. Each class of gladiator was crafted for spectacle. The retiarius with his trident and net, the secutor with a smooth helmet that trapped heat, the murmillo with a heavy shield that slowed his steps but pleased the crowd. None of this was about fairness. It was about theater. Rome craved balance, not mercy. A fight had to look even, but it never truly was. The crowd didn't want equality. They wanted suspense. The moment one fighter stumbled, the arena exploded in cheers or laughter. The chant began, Jugula, Jugula. Kill him. Some gladiators won fame. Their names were whispered like legends. Statues were carved, women sent gifts, crowds shouted loyalty. But even the most celebrated warrior remained a slave. The emperor could decide his fate with a turn of the thumb. Occasionally, mercy was granted. A fighter who displayed great courage might earn freedom, a wooden sword called the rudis. Yet even then, many returned. The roar of the crowd was intoxicating. Outside the arena, they were nobodies. Inside it, they were gods. But for most, glory ended on the sand. Broken bones, deep cuts, infections, death rarely came clean. Doctors worked in shadows, stitching wounds, preparing the next body for another show. Not all matches were honest. Some were rigged. Some were massacres. Prisoners armed would face professionals with steel. Their deaths were foregone conclusions, paraded as sport. And yet, amid the horror, something deeply human flickered. Two men locked in combat might share a final glance, a brief, wordless respect before one fell. In that instant, even Rome's cruelty couldn't erase their humanity. To the crowd, they were entertainment. To history, they were a mirror. The empire's might was built on their bodies. And every cheer that rose from the stands carried the same truth. Rome's glory came at the price of another man's life. For centuries, the arena was a man's world. Strength, brutality, and death were its currency. Yet even here, Rome found new boundaries to break. When the crowds grew restless, the empire gave them something unthinkable, women with swords. They were called gladiatrices. At first, they appeared as novelty, a curious twist to amuse a crowd that thought it had seen everything. But when they stepped onto the sand, shields raised, eyes fixed, the laughter faded. The sight of a woman fighting to the death unsettled even Rome's hardened spectators. Most were slaves or captives. A few were free women seeking attention, glory, or rebellion against a world that confined them. They trained like men, fought like men, and bled the same. The difference was how Rome watched them. To many, these women were both thrilling and shameful, a spectacle that challenged every idea of order and virtue. Writers like Juvenal mocked them. He described women abandoning silk and perfume to wield blades, calling it disgraceful. Yet his outrage only confirmed their impact. The arena stripped away social rules. Here, class, gender, and dignity meant nothing. Only survival mattered. Their matches were crafted for sensation. Some fought dwarfs for comic effect. Others faced beasts to test the limits of endurance. Records mention women battling lions, a vision both horrifying and mesmerizing. They weren't treated as equals to men. They were used as symbols, proof that no one, not even women of rank, was beyond Rome's hunger for spectacle. The armor they wore told its own story. Lighter helmets, often open-faced, revealed their features. The audience wanted to see expressions: fear, rage, exhaustion. Every emotion became part of the performance. When they fell, the crowd's reaction was complicated. Some cheered, some turned away. Even in a society numb to blood, watching a woman die stirred discomfort. Rome thrived on contradiction. It demanded order while feeding on chaos. A few gladiatrices earned admiration. Their names survive on fragments of marble, alongside victories and spoils. One inscription honors Amazon and Achillea, two female fighters whose battle drew thunderous applause. But even triumph couldn't free them from a system that owned them. Their victories, like their deaths, belonged to the empire. Eventually, the novelty faded. By the late 1st century, female combat was banned. The Senate deemed it indecent, a stain on Roman virtue. Yet the fact it ever happened revealed something deeper. Rome's cruelty was creative. It never stopped inventing ways to shock itself. The appearance of women in the arena showed how far the empire would go to feed its obsession. In a culture built on domination, even gender became a weapon. And as the crowd screamed approval, no one asked the question that lingered beneath the blood. If Rome would make its daughters die for amusement, what would it not destroy for control? By midday, the sun burned white above the Colosseum. The crowd had cheered through sword fights and hunts, but now came what many truly waited for: the executions. Rome called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It was punishment wrapped in theater, a performance where the guilty became unwilling actors. For the condemned, there were no speeches, no pleas, no second chances. Their fate had already been written into the day's program. Prisoners, slaves, deserters, rebels, all marched into the sand. Each carried a crime, each assigned a death. Thieves were torn apart by wolves. Arsonists were burned alive. Traitors were thrown to lions. The arena became a courtroom without mercy, where verdicts ended in roars, not gavel strikes. But these weren't random killings. They were lessons. Every death served a purpose. Rome turned punishment into propaganda. The crowd saw justice made visible. The empire wanted them to believe that order depended on obedience, and that disobedience meant spectacle. To heighten the terror, executioners staged these deaths like plays. Criminals were forced to act out myths before dying. A man playing Orpheus was mauled by a bear mid-song. Another, as Icarus, plunged from a contraption meant to mimic flight. A woman cast as Dirce was tied to a bull and dragged to pieces. It wasn't enough to die. They had to die symbolically. The cruelty was meticulous. Before release, lions and leopards were starved to frenzy. Their handlers teased them with blood-soaked rags, driving them mad. When the gates opened, chaos exploded. The victims screamed, the beasts pounced, and the crowd surged to its feet. For a brief, terrible moment, man and animal became part of the same theater of control. Even fire joined the show. Prisoners coated in pitch were lit as living torches. Their bodies flailed against the stakes, while vendors sold wine in the aisles. The people called them tunica molesta, the burning shirt. Philosophers later wrote that these scenes hardened the heart, turning citizens into spectators of suffering. But few listened. The spectacle drowned out the conscience. Sometimes, condemned men were forced to fight wild animals themselves, armed with dull blades or wooden spears. Survival was impossible, but struggle made the show last longer. In one festival under Emperor Trajan, thousands were killed over 100 days. The scale was staggering, but the message remained simple. Rome decides who lives, who dies, and how. Every execution was theater. Every scream was applause. The arena taught the people to cheer for punishment, to equate cruelty with justice. And once they learned that lesson, they carried it beyond the walls. The games didn't just entertain, they conditioned. And as the crowd shouted for more, Rome discovered there were still darker ways to turn death into art. Rome's cruelty didn't stop with swords or beasts. When blood and flame lost their thrill, the empire turned to the elements themselves. Water and fire became props in a theater of death. Where nature resisted, Rome engineered it. The obsession began with Julius Caesar. In 46 BC, he ordered an enormous basin dug near the Tiber. It wasn't for ships or trade, but for slaughter. Thousands of condemned men were forced aboard real vessels to reenact a sea battle. Arrows flew. Catapults fired. The decks ran red as men drowned or burned. Caesar watched from a gilded seat, the crowd roaring with every sinking ship. It was called naumachia, a naval spectacle, and it was madness made grand. Augustus expanded the scale. He built an artificial lake, fed by an aqueduct solely for these battles. 30 warships clashed there, each packed with men who knew they would never leave alive. The message was unmistakable. Rome could create oceans where none existed, could summon storms with command alone. Even nature obeyed the emperor. By Claudius' reign, the madness reached new heights. To celebrate draining a lake, he filled it again, just to stage another mock war. Prisoners saluted him with the haunting words, Ave Caesar, morituri salutant. Those who are about to die salute you. Whether rehearsed or desperate, it captured the hopelessness of men turned into props. The Colosseum itself was built to sustain such illusions. Engineers carved channels beneath the arena floor. They could flood the sand for miniature sea battles, then drain it for combat the next day. Each transformation was an act of power, proof that even water could be conquered for amusement. Fire had its own role. Executions turned into pyres. Prisoners wearing pitch-soaked tunics became living torches. Some were cast as mythical heroes. Hercules consumed by flames, Mucius Scaevola holding his hand in fire to prove loyalty. What once symbolized bravery was twisted into mockery. Every spectacle blurred reality. Death merged with performance. The empire's strength became inseparable from its cruelty. To rule men, Rome learned to command the elements. To prove divinity, emperors set oceans ablaze. Spectators marveled, but some trembled. Philosophers whispered that Rome was tempting fate, that those who played gods would die like mortals. They weren't wrong. Many emperors who reveled in these spectacles met violent ends. Yet even as leaders fell, the games went on. The machinery of death was too well built to stop. The crowds wanted wonder, and Rome delivered, no matter the cost. By mastering fire and water, Rome believed it had mastered the world. But every illusion came with a price. And beneath the applause, a quiet truth echoed through the stone. When a civilization turns nature into a weapon, it begins to burn itself. At the height of Rome's power, the arena became more than entertainment. It was the emperor's mirror, a place where rulers could see their own glory, or their madness, reflected in blood. Some used it to rule. Others used it to feed their delusions. Caligula was one of the first to blur the line. When the supply of animals ran out mid-show, he refused to send the crowd home. Instead, he pointed to the stands. Ordinary spectators were dragged down, armed with nothing, and slaughtered to fill the schedule. It wasn't about the games anymore. It was about control, showing that even the audience was expendable. Then came Nero, Rome's self-proclaimed artist. To him, the arena was a stage for ego. He ordered prisoners to die acting out scenes from his favorite plays, forcing men to scream lines as blades cut them down. He called it art. Rome called it insanity. But no one embodied the sickness of spectacle like Commodus. Draped in lion skins and clutching a club, he entered the arena dressed as Hercules reborn. The crowd was forced to watch as he slaughtered chained beasts, crippled men, even ostriches. Each death was choreographed to glorify him. To refuse applause was treason. Silence could cost your life. He fought as a gladiator too, but only when victory was certain. His opponents carried blunted weapons. His armor was reinforced. Every match was theater, every kill a lie. Yet he demanded the full price of fame, even charging the treasury for his performances. Rome bled coins, while its emperor played God in the sand. The more the emperors used the games to feed vanity, the more the system decayed. The arena, once a symbol of power, turned into a stage for paranoia. Domitian held hunts by torchlight at midnight. using the darkness to unsettle the crowd. He wanted them nervous, obedient, always aware that the show could turn on them. Even the so-called good emperors were not innocent. Trajan, remembered for justice and reform, celebrated victory with 103 days of games. Thousands of lives were ended not from cruelty, but from habit. Violence had become the language of celebration. The emperors believed that by giving the people death, they gave them unity. But each spectacle chipped away at Rome's soul. The cheers grew louder, but the meaning behind them faded. In time, the rulers who lived for the arena often died by the sword. Caligula was cut down by his guards. Nero took his own life. Commodus was strangled in his bath. The empire that fed on spectacle began to consume itself. The arena had become a mirror, and what Rome saw in its reflection was not strength, but rot. Amid the thunder of the crowd, a few voices dared to whisper. They saw what others refused to. They saw that Rome's glory was rotting from within. Seneca was one of them, a philosopher and tutor to Nero. He once attended a midday execution. What he witnessed haunted him. Men burned, torn, and mocked before laughter. When he left, he confessed that the games hardened the soul. "I came expecting sport," he wrote, "but found cruelty." The arena didn't purify citizens. It poisoned them. Cicero, long before Seneca, had warned of this sickness too. He believed courage was noble when used in war, but empty when used for show. Yet even he admitted the people demanded blood. Bread and spectacle kept them loyal. He could see the danger, but he could not stop it. As centuries passed, others spoke out. The poet Juvenal mocked a Rome that had traded discipline for distraction. The people, he sneered, long for only two things, bread and circuses. To him, the hunger for spectacle revealed how far the city had fallen from its republican ideals. Citizens once ruled by reason were now ruled by applause. Not all dissent came from philosophers. Some came from faith. Early Christians saw the arena as the heart of Rome's sin. They refused to bow to idols, refused to cheer death. For that defiance, they became part of the show. Thrown to lions, burned alive, crucified under the gaze of thousands. Tertullian, one of the first Christian thinkers, condemned the games as the seedbed of cruelty. Watching men die, he argued, trained a mind to enjoy suffering. He asked a question few dared to voice. If Rome glorified killing, could it ever claim to be civilized? These dissenters were not popular. They spoke against pleasure, against power, against tradition. But their words outlived the cheers. In their writings, we glimpsed the conscience Rome tried to silence. Even among common people, fatigue began to grow. The endless repetition of blood numbed the thrill. Some citizens started leaving early, complaining that the shows felt empty. When violence becomes routine, it loses its sting. But the system needed noise. Silence meant danger. So emperors raised the stakes, larger beasts, stranger stunts, crueler fates. The voices that called for restraint were drowned by the roar of habit. Still, those few who saw through the illusion left warnings etched in ink. They understood that a society built on cruelty cannot endure. It devours empathy, then reason, then itself. By the twilight of the empire, their words felt like prophecy. The stones of the Colosseum still stood, but the ideals that built Rome had crumbled. By the 5th century, the cheers had faded. The Colosseum still towered over Rome, but the seats were empty, the sand silent. For generations, it had been the beating heart of the empire, a machine that turned death into unity. But the empire that once fed it had begun to starve. Economy collapsed. Borders cracked. Armies that once conquered the world now defended scraps of it. And without wealth, without victories, there were no games left to fund. The silence felt strange. For centuries, the people had measured time in festivals, not seasons. Without the roar of crowds or the clash of steel, the city felt hollow. The empire that had worshipped violence could no longer afford its god. Yet the echoes remained. You can still hear them in the stones, faint, almost ghostly. Every corridor beneath the Colosseum once led to a cage, a cell, a door that opened only one way. The structure endures, but its purpose lingers like a scar. Historians often call Rome the pinnacle of civilization. Roads, laws, architecture, all true. But the arena tells another story. A story of what happens when cruelty becomes culture, when power begins to believe that suffering is strength. Rome taught the world that violence could entertain. The idea never died. Centuries later, public executions filled squares. Crowds still gathered to watch pain dressed as justice. Even now, our screens replay conflict for pleasure. The setting changed. The impulse remained. The Colosseum became a ruin, but its lesson survived. That is its most haunting legacy. Philosophers asked whether a society that cheers for blood can ever truly call itself great. Rome answered in its own ruins. The empire that ruled continents could not rule its own appetite. What began as ritual became addiction. What began as duty became disease. When you walk its tunnels today, you feel it, the chill, the weight of history pressed into stone. Tourists marvel at the scale, the engineering, the view. Few imagine the sound of chains, or the smell of death rising from the sand. Yet the truth is simple. The Colosseum wasn't built to inspire. It was built to control. Every fight, every hunt, every execution was a message. Rome commands all, even the meaning of life and death. But no empire can outlast the cruelty it normalizes. The Colosseum stands, but the world that built it is gone. And in that emptiness lies the warning. A civilization that teaches its people to cheer for pain will one day fall silent, when there's no one left to applaud. Tell us what you think. Which of Rome's spectacles, the beast hunts, the burning torches, or the emperor's madness, best reveals its darkest soul? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into history's shadows.